Debunking Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Socialism Means Slavery, Part 1. Introduction. The purpose of this multi-part series is to debunk the thesis put forward in F.A. Hayek's seminal work The Road to Serfdom, wherein he suggests that Western civilization had been moving towards socialism and that this was ultimately a road to destruction and servitude. Much of what is said in regard to socialism today is merely a re-articulation of what Hayek said so many decades ago. This is why it is imperative, as a socialist, to completely dispel all the falsehoods he promotes so that we can make clear what the legacy and mission of socialism really is. Some might think this is a scholarly endeavor, revisiting works from the last century for the purpose of some aggrandizing intellectual adventure. Nothing could be farther from the truth. As my series will show, what Hayek has said continues to be the battle cry against all progressive and revolutionary efforts throughout the world. Reactionaries of every stripe come bearing the words of Hayek as though the future of liberation is entirely doomed because one man made a few assertions over 50 years ago. Perhaps this reveals the true depravity of the right wing, but regardless, we should take very seriously the effort to debunk the baseless nonsense of Hayek so that the people can see through the ideological garbage fed to them. The series is separated into several parts, each composing 2 chapters or more, therefore making the series as comprehensive as possible. Because Hayek wrote so spaciously, the reader will find I seem to jump around from point to point, perhaps without much of a coherent line. However, this is done so that every claim Hayek makes can be fully debunked. I will make use of quotations from the text, and any additional allusions will be sourced and explained in references at the end. Chapter 1, The Abandoned Road. What's most interesting about Hayek's opening chapter is that he does not begin with a cursory explanation of the ideas he writes about, as many writers on the subject do. Instead, he starts with many poetic appeals to the sentiments of the presumably white European reader. This writing strategy, if it could be called that, becomes more important as the book goes on. However, it should be clear from the start his intentions for even writing the book. He wants to invoke the romanticized memories of Europe of old, the tales of European glory, history, and progress. This is really his primary strategy for criticizing socialism, which should be noted, he lumps in with fascism as well, being that he wants to make it seem to the reader to be unauthentic, not within the lineage of European progress but as this foreign and externalized foe. The title of the chapter, The Abandoned Road, truly says it all. Hayek very early makes the claim that this road to serfdom, which is the perceived European progression towards socialism, is an abandonment of those prized principles long held in high regard throughout Europe. We are ready to accept almost any explanation, except one, that the present state of the world may be the result of genuine error on our part, and that the pursuit of some of our most cherished ideals has apparently produced results utterly different from those which we expected. 1. So what exactly was this genuine error? What was the road that was abandoned? Hayek goes on to explain in the following pages. We are rapidly abandoning not the views merely of Cobden and Bright, of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and Romans. Not merely 19th and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Erasmus and Montaigne, from Cicero and Tacitus, Pericles and Thucydides, is progressively relinquished. 2. Now the story becomes much more clear. In the mind of Hayek, the acceptance of socialism and progressive ideals by some within Europe is tantamount to the abolition of the whole history of European development, which he clearly holds quite sacred. Here we will make a few points. 1. As is perhaps already clear, Hayek is an idealist. And not even an idealist in some sort of redeemable sense or the idealism of the Hegelians. All of history, according to Hayek, has been guided by ideas, or as he refers to it in his social context, the European thought. Immediately anyone familiar with dialectics or any materialist philosophy can identify the problem. History is not some arena of ideas, a protracted conflict between the thought of this people/region against this people/region, each with its own essential characteristics to be discovered and utilized. Rather, history as explained by Marx is a history of class struggle. But what exactly does this mean? It means that the primary locomotive of history is not the ideas of people but their concrete social contradictions located in an existing material framework, namely in the mode of production. It was not the ideal of liberalism which did away with feudal Europe, it was the burgeoning success of entrepreneurs, of petty capitalists become advanced capitalists, who wrestled social power away from the feudal monarchies and absolutist regimes. Hayek, here, can only see one half of the coin. He can somewhat identify competing ideologies in the midst of social change, but he cannot identify the material forces upon which these ideologies are founded. What spells death to capitalism, in Europe and around the world, is not some genuine error or the ideals of a few progressives, it is the material force of humanity in contradiction. The working class and oppressed people seek to destroy capitalism and unleash their potential because of their material condition as workers and as the oppressed. Integral to any progressive ideology or ideal is the material foundation, perhaps transcendent in some cases, that places a subject in the conditions to be revolutionary. Ideas do not define history, social forces do, and it is true that these social forces produce ideas and that these ideas act upon material forces themselves, but this nuance is entirely absent from Hayek. He is an idealist unable to comprehend the real motion and force of history and society. 2. Hayek is a reactionary. May be obvious by now but worth emphasis. What Hayek really wants to stress is a preservation of this European thought and Western civilization. He is a classic example of an individual motivated entirely by his own privileged social location to the defense of the old society, constantly making poetic and pseudo-intellectual allusions to the good old days. Despite this, he is constantly presenting himself as this novel individual fighting against the pervasive sentiments of totalitarianism which plague the good wholesome Christian Europe. A great and hardly believable charade, really. After the first chapter it becomes questionable whether or not he is even a real classical liberal or a pseudo-monarchist in liberal clothing. The prevailing slogan of every reactionary is "This is a mistake," because nothing is more earth-shattering to a genuine reactionary than the prospect of social change, which is possibly the only thing intrinsic to the whole human experience in history. Hayek continues on the chapter with the expected defense of the achievements of laissez-faire capitalism and the free entrepreneur. All of which he claims has been constructive and beneficial to Europe and the world as a whole. The result of this growth surpassed all expectations. Wherever the barriers to the free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, man became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire. And while the rising standard soon led to the discovery of very dark spots in society, spots which men were no longer willing to tolerate, there was probably no class that did not substantially benefit from the general advance. The working man in the Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence which 100 years before seemed scarcely possible. 3. In a phrase, capitalism was awesome because it advanced the productive forces and made everyone feel good about their liberal values handed down to them. Sure, there was some dark spots, but overall everything was greener on the other side. Let's make a few points. 1. Every epoch of human history has brought an advancement of the productive forces. That is sort of how the accumulation of knowledge works in regard to technology and the construction/improvement of existing means. Hayek here gives too much credit to the advent of something rather expected in the course of history. It's true, however, that capitalism did experience spectacular growth in regard to the Western world. The circulation of capital meant profound investment in the productive forces and the creation of nearly every human industry we understand today. However, Hayek misses the internal contradictions of capital accumulation as well as its conjuncture with existing social formations outside of Europe. The spectacular growth mentioned meant the forcible movement of millions of rural laborers into the dark, cramped, terrible industrial cities of Europe. Often where conditions were far worse than even their more backward mode of existence in the rural areas. Life for the industrial proletariat at the beginning of capitalism was horrendous, and continues to be for those exploited in our modern era, and perhaps this is what Hayek means with his dark spots, but even then his claims are wild underestimates of the true human toll of this reckless and brutal productive explosion. None of this begins to mention the parallel colonial exploitation within what he terms the New World, as well as the ongoing pillaging of Asia and Africa. In Hayek's eyes, it's not whether the non-Western world is peripheral, but whether it exists at all as a functional society worthy of respect. To Hayek's contemplation of free exercise and personal freedom is of course built upon the liberal social construction of the free man, importantly not a free woman, as to Hayek and many intellectuals a male-centric analysis is standard. It's far too tempting at this point to reiterate what Lenin said at the beginning of the 20th century, freedom for who and to do what. It's important to imagine the notion of freedom as being inextricably bound to a set parameter of acceptable action, meaning that freedom can only exist within limits of action. Freedom, within capitalism, argued Lenin, was freedom for the slave owner, freedom for the exploiter to do his exploiting for. Hayek, of course, would very much disagree, not simply to the terminology employed as well, arguing that in fact the freedom of capitalism is the freedom of entrepreneurship, the endeavor of every free man to pursue his own aspirations and make his own way. For Hayek, it's not so much as describing capitalist society but romanticizing it. A Marxist has no desire in romanticizing this or that. Revolutionary science is about making clear what was previously hidden, uncovering the contradictions within society which continue to drive our social realm. Quite the opposite of what happens in the process of bourgeois apologism such as that from Hayek. Nothing could provide a greater contrast than a study of The Road to Serfdom, wherein Hayek makes sweeping claims regarding the moral character of capitalism contrasted to what he calls collectivism. On the opposite hand, Marx, a century before Hayek, in his seminal work Capital, provides an objective and abstract criticism of political economy, as a whole, as practiced by bourgeois economists. Marx was dedicated to uncovering, for the people, what had been previously hidden, the same mission we uphold today. Before finishing our analysis of the first chapter, we should visit the primary phrase which captures so much attention from popular readers: socialism means slavery. 5. Perhaps the most integral phrase to the entire book, Hayek's presentation of socialism as slavery makes clear the bourgeois sentiment regarding even the possibility of liberation, absolute terror. However, one must ask, if socialism is slavery, what exactly is capitalism? What is capitalism to the billions who live on less than $2 a day? What is capitalism millions of children who go hungry every night? What is capitalism to the single mom working 3 jobs just to scrape by? What is capitalism to the homeless man begging outside the Louis Vuitton store? If capitalism really is freedom, then I cannot fathom what an unholy hell socialism must be. But what really is socialism? Socialism is the political power of the working class and oppressed peoples concretely realized. The incredible idea that human need, potential, and progress is more important than making a profit. Socialism is the audacious demand that everyone deserves a meaningful existence not plagued by servitude and exploitation, an opportunity to realize themselves and better humanity as a whole. What an unimaginable terror socialism must be. Now Hayek is right to claim that socialism means prohibition in some cases. Some freedoms must be abolished. But just what sort of freedoms does socialism abolish? The freedom to exploit, the freedom to oppress, the freedom to discriminate against others, the freedom to exclude whole swaths of the population, the freedom to dehumanize, the freedom to objectify, the freedom to terrorize. All of these modern-day freedoms must be swept away for socialism to succeed. In this sense, I completely agree with Hayek. Socialism is slavery, an eternal slavery for those whose only desire is to subjugate others. In addition, some institutions and proliferated ideas must also be swept away. Racism must be eliminated, sexism must be eliminated, heteronormativity must be eliminated, patriarchy must be eliminated, ableism must be eliminated, every form of conceivable oppression wherein some group of people are subjugated to another must be done away with. So in a sense, the old society along with its values must tossed into the dustbin of history. We are unapologetic in this regard, and to Hayek, what could be more terrifying than the looming possibility of human liberation? Chapter 2, The Great Utopia. Hayek opens Chapter 2 with much of the same rhetoric, merely continued onto another page. It's a distinct possibility the first 2 chapters were written as an extended opening and only edited as separate selections after the fact. Regardless, Hayek makes general claims regarding the socialists' desire to limit freedom and invokes utopian socialists such as Saint Simon to make the point. The illusion is quite disingenuous, considering modern and even most 19th century socialists had little in common with the utopian speculation of Saint Simon. His sort of nonsense was heavily criticized for its clear failures by Engels in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Perhaps Hayek never read Engels, or more likely he was just drawing abject connections for the point of defaming actual revolutionary theory. Upon analyzing the democratic currents of socialism in the 19th century, although he treats these breaks as continuities rather than scientific and qualitative ruptures, as they were, he concludes that democracy is entirely incompatible with socialism. Nobody saw more clearly than Tocqueville that democracy was an essentially individualist institution, stood in an irreconcilable conflict with socialism. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man, socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference: while democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. 6. First, one must question the individualism of a social system based upon the quantitative accumulation of abstract social value, money, wherein one's entire existence depends on her ability to acquire more money. Perhaps not the system most friendly to those who seek an individual expression outside of what is accepted by the ruling class of capital owners. Second, as Lenin noted, capitalism does have democracy, democracy for the slaveholder, as cited earlier. Every dollar has a vote, almost literally. No money? Tough luck, I suppose. It's laughable to conclude that a system of decision-making where those with more wealth have more influence could be anything but a functional tyranny. Furthermore, what could be more dehumanizing, regarding cold calculations, use of numbers, etc., than the dictatorship of financial capital that dominates our social system? Billions of jobs, thousands of homes, endless livelihood rests on the speculative dance of numbers across a spectacular screen. In the event those numbers show retraction, the market crashes, and literally lives are ended. What sort of democracy is that? Hayek goes on to claim socialists very subtly challenged the common understanding of freedom to include economic freedom. However, one can hardly call the historic challenge of freedom something of a plot to lure liberals into socialism, as Hayek contends. 7. Rather, redefining freedom as it had been put forward before is something inherent to any significant social movement. Even in the French Revolution, the Jacobins wanted to challenge feudal understandings of freedom as that provided by God and mediated by the monarchy. They wanted to redefine freedom to reinforce their own class interests. Therefore, it's not surprising that socialists of the 19th and 20th centuries wanted to expand our understanding of freedom to include life-affirming freedoms such as that to housing, a job, retirement security, etc. Nonetheless, Hayek takes particular issue with this expanded understanding of freedom, a very common theme throughout the book, clearly. Freedom in this sense is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. The demand for new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for an equal distribution of wealth. 8. Once again we find Hayek attempting to draw connections between socialism and old feudal doctrines of equality and utopian promises. There is not much to dislike about socialism, unless of course you are a member of the ruling class or one of their stooges, so Hayek goes about drawing as many nightmarish connections as one can imagine. None of which are particularly compelling and all of which can be easily proven wrong with a rudimentary study of history and socialist theory. But Hayek's dystopian web only snowballs into a complete conflation of socialism with fascism. Observer after observer, has been impressed with the extraordinary similarity in many respects of the conditions under fascism and communism. Instead of being better, Stalinism is worse than fascism, more ruthless, barbarous, unjust, immoral, anti-democratic, unredeemed by any hope or scruple, and that it is better described as super-fascist. 9. Lenin correctly described fascism as actually being capitalism in decay. 10. What does that mean precisely? Well, as the internal contradictions of capitalism become more pronounced, throughout its development, the ruling class makes considerable social concessions to the opportunists among the working class in order to preserve capitalism as a whole. Fascism is a classic example of class collaborationism dominated by the bourgeoisie, not an example of socialism, wherein the working class and oppressed peoples make up the dominant class in society. In fascism, the ruling class is left largely intact, a few political enemies might be expropriated, some popular concessions made, but capital still runs the show without a question. This fundamental difference between fascism and socialism is gone without mention in Hayek's short appraisal. Once again, conflating socialism with some other popularly undesirable system is essentially his strategy throughout most of the book. His remarks regarding Stalinism are also quaint and expected. First, no one in a genuine sense could have much love for the Stalin period within the Soviet Union. Not as if there were not tremendous achievements by the young socialist country, there certainly were. However, this period was marked by crippling material desperation, as an isolated and underdeveloped socialist center, and political turmoil as the world's first socialist country made bold steps into a future never traveled before. Second, his referencing of Stalinism is politically and historically empty. As modern historians such as J. Getty have shown, the Soviet Union from 1928 to 1953 was hardly Stalin's playground for his evil desires. 11. Rather, the political landscape of the Soviet Union was complicated and intricate down to the municipal apparatuses of the young Communist Party. Political contradictions between landed classes, the new Bolsheviks, and the old Bolsheviks gave rise to a plethora of antagonisms, certainly exacerbating any existing crises. Therefore, recent historical work has very much admonished Stalin himself of the failures and controversies during that period and instead given greater light to the whole administration of the Communist Party and Soviet government, especially at the local nodes. This makes sense in regard to a Marxist study of history, the application of historical materialism, where attention is given not to individual great men of history but rather the broad social forces and their contradictions which made such individuals manifest and drove the course of history. Another contention is the way in which Hayek glosses over the relative success of socialism and absolute failure of fascism. The Soviet Union went from perhaps the most backward nation in Europe at the time of revolution in 1917, to a world superpower rivaling industrial giants such as the United States in 1945-12. Keep in mind that the first five-year plan began nearly 11 years after the revolution in 1928. The success of the socialist plan in developing the productive forces of society is absolutely unprecedented even by standards of the early industrial revolution. Fascist Italy and Germany, on the other hand, were tin castles which floated only on speculative war spending. 13. Their economies were hardly sustainable in the long haul, which is perhaps even a reason why the Nazis were so eager to invade Poland after their series of expansions southward. In another sphere, the young Soviet Union achieved monumental progress in the social liberation of marginalized groups. Russia had always been a prison house of nations, forcibly repressing dissident nationalities from the independence and self-determination they deserved. The Soviet Union established a formal body by which minority nationalities could express their demands and achieve the recognition they deserved, although some would rightly argue that even these measures did not go far enough, a progressive achievement far ahead of any Western nation, certainly the ultranationalist and xenophobic fascists of Europe. Women were also fully recognized members of Soviet society, equal in rights to their male counterparts, and able to express themselves as full humans. And while black people in the United States were being hosed down by riot police, segregated, and thrown in jail, racial discrimination in the Soviet Union was completely abolished. Every man, woman, and child regardless of race walked as equals in fellowship among the streets, something the United States today still struggles to achieve. Ultimately, we could dedicate hours to disproving Hayek's ridiculous conflation between European fascism and Soviet socialism at the time, but we would only be exhausting ourselves. In the end, there is a very real difference between the fascists and socialists of the time. The difference lies between those who started the Holocaust and those who ended it. Hayek continues the chapter building off of his conflation made previously. He explores avenues by which Marxism has led to fascism and all sorts of similarly unfounded claims. 14. His only strand of evidence lies in the fact that many of the prominent Nazis and fascists of the period were previously socialists to some extent, as if this is some sort of little-known gotcha moment. Clearly, many fascist leaders were previously associated with socialist movements. As stated earlier, fascists are the cream of political opportunism, capitalizing on the energy of the masses for their own intentions at preserving the status quo. In this sense, it's no surprise that leaders like Benito Mussolini fancied themselves socialists for a period. However, any close study of the same leaders, e.g. Mussolini, reveals a train of political opportunism, flopping sides, changing rhetoric, and general appeasement. The fact many fascists considered themselves socialists is no indictment of socialism but rather an insight into their own opportunist strategy made possible by class collaboration. In the following page, Hayek builds his argument by noting how, for example, in both Italy and Germany fascists and socialists competed for the support of the same type of mind. 15. This has just the smallest kernel of truth to it. In the early stages of the fascist movement in Europe, both fascist corporatists and socialist unionists were indeed locked in a struggle at the ballot box and most certainly at the workplace. Once again, not surprising given the opportunist and pseudo-populist prose of the fascists at the time. However, as time went on, certainly this all changed. The greatest support for fascism in Germany and Italy came not from the working class, as we commonly understand it, but actually from arguably lumpenized portions of the military apparatus. Unemployed soldiers from the previous World War, feeling alienated and longing for pride again, became the henchmen of both Hitler and Mussolini before and during their respective regimes. 16. The communists and socialists found strength among the working classes but were unable to fully capitalize in that respect. Remember, after the fascist rise to power in both Germany and Italy, it was the communists, socialists, and trade unionists who were tossed in jail or the concentration camp first. Therefore, any competition between fascists and socialists early on as indicative of the two being similar in principle is absolute nonsense that any honest study of history can easily dispel. After making many similar and numerous claims in the following pages, Hayek finally makes the summary points of his entire chapter. That democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something so utterly different that few of those who now wish it would be prepared to accept the consequences. Many will not believe the connection has been laid bare in all its aspects. 17. Before addressing his final statement, we should revisit his train of argumentation, throughout the chapter, leading up to this point. First, socialism was authoritarian and undemocratic until some sly socialists subtly changed the definition of freedom, all of which we showed was a certain and blatant misrepresentation. Second, he conflates socialism with fascism and makes a quip regarding the super-fascist nature of Stalinism, something that was easily and distinctly debunked through a more holistic study of history. Finally, he finds refuge in the fact that at some point fascists and socialists were in steep competition, therefore indicating we must be similar at least in principle. Although, once again, he is proven wrong simply by revisiting the historical period with an eye towards the developing social contradictions between the evolving classes in Europe just prior to World War II. Hayek's final conclusion? Democratic socialism is a utopian fantasy and unattainable because of his previously established, false, premises and subsequent, fallacious, conclusions. 1. Socialism, if it is actually socialism in the way described by Marxists over the previous centuries, must be a democratic socialism. Not in the parliamentary sense or in the bourgeois sense of the representative democracy, but an organic democracy for the people. If socialism is not guided by the people with the interests of the people, then it is simply not socialism by its very cardinal traits. 2. Socialism is only as utopian as we consider the scientific advancement of humanity to be utopian. Certainly, 100 years ago the idea of humans landing on the moon was out of the question, utopian even. Now we seem to parade around the galaxy as if it were our own cosmic backyard. The primary edifice of any reactionary is an implausible mistrust of the future. Anything which transcends the fundamental contradictions of our present society must be considered totally unattainable, or else the entire fabric of our totality would disintegrate. People around the world are constantly informed by the bourgeois media, theorists, and popular culture that this is the best we got. But like peasants under the Habsburg dynasty during the French Revolution, we can look clearly upon examples to the contrary and know that this is not the best we can have. Looking back at socialist experiments only reaffirms our desire to make the future more than plausible but actualize the success we know from collective experience is attainable. That is the revolutionary optimism which is the existential enemy of reactionary charlatans like F.A. Hayek, those individuals who spend their days deriding the achievements of the masses and doubting the possibility of any substantive liberation. We already know that a better future is possible. Not only is it possible, it is certain with the concerted effort of the masses in a way hardly conceived by ruling class stooges such as Hayek and his modern successors. If socialism is only a great utopia, then consider the past and present revolutionaries the real visionaries for the whole of humanity, progressing endlessly towards an absolute liberation of all people everywhere. Debunking Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Individualism and Collectivism, Part 2. Chapter 3. Individualism and Collectivism. The title of this chapter is, in my own opinion, quite a misnomer. In fact, Hayek spends as little time as possible truly outlining what he considers to be collectivism or individualism beyond a rudimentary appraisal in the first few pages. Most of the chapter is spent detailing the tendency towards a planned economy in the West, the reasoning behind it, and why this is bad. Regardless, we will go about debunking Hayek's claims as they appear, with special attention given to certain structural arguments which give base to subsequent claims. On the first page, Hayek starts by noting confusion over what precisely socialism entails. He claims that not only does its socialism imply a sense of justice and equality, but also the means by which to arrive at such a society. In this sense, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership of the means of production, and the creation of a system of planned economy in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a central planning body. 1. At the conceptual level, Hayek is absolutely correct. Socialism does require the abolition of private entrepreneurship as well as the establishment of some common plan of production, a la Marx. The extent by which we consider the central body to be a direct replacement of the directing market forces or a scientific advancement in the way the whole system functions is still debated. However, it certainly cannot be ignored that in the history of socialism, centrally planned bodies have played a strategic role in building up to socialism in the rational allocation of resources. Hayek then returns to his previous tirade of claiming socialists have been arm-twisting liberals into accepting socialism, by far the most important species of collectivism too. Social justice, he argues, or at least the current ideas of social justice, requires a conscious distributive program that the free market cannot sustain. Therefore, socialists argue strongly in favor of the use of a central plan 3. However, he continues to drive home the fact that the liberal conception of planning within an economy is very different than the socialist. Planning owes its popularity largely to the fact that everybody desires, of course, that we should handle our common problems as rationally as possible, and that, in doing so, we should use as much foresight as we can command. In this sense, everyone who is not a complete fatalist is a planner, but it is not in the sense that our enthusiasts for a planned society now employ this term. According to modern planners, and for their purposes, it is not sufficient to design the most rational permanent framework within which various activities would be conducted by different persons according to their individual plans. This liberal plan, according to them, is no plan. 4. He uses the above premise to bridge into a discussion of whether a central plan or a liberal plan is more preferable. The question is whether for this purpose it is better that the holder of coercive power should confine himself in general to creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given best scope so that they can plan more successfully, or whether a rational utilization of our resources requires central direction and organization of all our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. 5. Let's start with a few points. 1. Capitalism is an anarchy of production. Not in the proverbial or preferable sense of a relatively horizontal system of some equitable nature. The allocation of resources is arguably done irrationally according to the maxim of production for use. Moreover, capitalist production and distribution is hardly able to account for its own internal contradictions which are in a constant flux causing the crises we so regularly experience. The argument in favor of planning the economy, from socialists at least, is not so much from a conceptual fetishism of reason and rationality but a more historic understanding of how capitalism actually functions. Socialism requires the concrete advancement of productive forces in a direction to enhance overall scientific technical knowledge of our own productive capacities. To put it briefly, socialism needs planning because the anarchic nature of the market makes prolonged and effective development of the productive forces towards communism impossible. 2. Capitalism has paved the way to socialist planning. Lenin once noted the necessity of developing certain capitalist methods as to progress in our own understanding of directing economic activity. Was he correct? Arguably, Walmart has done more to advance our own understanding of real-time consumer data, streamlining distribution, logistics, and technical discrepancies than any Soviet planner. The fact of the matter is that under monopoly capitalism, imperialism, much of the world economy is already collectively planned by a small network of massive corporations. The fantasy world of millions of mom-and-pop shops competing for those beloved customers is long past us. Only a handful of transnational firms maintain the concrete economic gravity which keeps capital circulating and the whole system in check. The world economy is already planned. The question is, planned for who? 3. Planning is not just for the obvious purposes. Developing the productive forces, while being very important, is not the only component of socialism, nor is it arguably the most important. Transforming the relations of production, the ways in which people relate to each other in the course of production, takes primacy in the construction of socialism, in our understanding, at least. Planning the economy allows us to transform these relations by eliminating certain elements of bourgeois society from the course of the labor process. For example, through planning the economy, labor no longer becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, rather, the time selling of labor power to the capitalist by the worker. Unemployment, homelessness, and hunger are no longer weapons to be used against the working class. The oppressed and exploited are able to concretely seize upon their own economic conditions and draft up a plan which empowers them and their own class position. This is the sort of subtleties to planning which Hayek completely glosses over, and arguably even some technocratic proponents of planning to some extent or another. 4. The creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given best scope so that they can plan more successfully is simply an advanced euphemism for refining the existing capitalist legal structure, formalizing the relations of production, relations of exploitation, so that they might become more efficient and seamless in their progression. All this talk about the initiative of individuals might as well be rhetoric from the holy gospel of the free market. In modern capitalism, even in early competitive capitalism, this initiative of the individual is negligible. Capitalists themselves are only stand-in functionaries, conductors, to the train of capital circulation. They are a necessity, but they themselves are certainly not, and neither is their initiative. What Hayek is concretely referencing here is the formalization of the social division of labor, the legal establishment of capitalist superiority and the supremacy of their relations of production, to an even greater extent than is already experienced. All of this planning talk and the question of individuality rather rhetorically posed by Hayek at the beginning of the chapter only becomes more empty as the book drags on. What sort of plan can even be posed by that of the proletariat, members of the exploited class and not the exploiter class? What sort of plan gives the oppressed and exploited the same individual initiative and social significance that is afforded to the bourgeoisie? Only a plan which involves the complete abolition of capitalism, imperialism, and every other system of oppression which keeps the people in one chain or another. The idea that a worker could empower herself through an individual plan, the liberal sort that Hayek makes mention of, is absolutely laughable. What is she to plan? Today I will get exploited, when I am done being exploited I will reproduce my bodily capacities, then I will go tomorrow and get exploited, etc., etc. Only the most detached and academic nonsense could possibly conjure a situation where the great mass of people are empowered by such empty individual plans. These plans are actually component parts of the collective myth of success. Something so rare that every time it occurs the ruling class must hoist such an example up high for the whole social formation to witness and then place it safely into a museum display for generations to pass by. In the words of Althusser, what is this individual plan, this hope of success, to the homeless man outside the Chanel store? How about the children growing up in New York's public housing? What is it to those single mothers grinding out an existence deep in Compton? Such an individual plan only makes sense if you are in fact the individual in question, a holder of capital, an exploiter, someone who wields the economic mechanisms of our society as a weapon against the working class. Only then does the plan that Hayek and others speak of have any relevance. Ultimately, Hayek ends this chapter with one final appeal to the decent sentiments of his readers. The idea of complete centralization of economic activity still appalls most people, not only because of the stupendous difficulty of the task, but even more because of the horror inspired by the idea of everything being directed from a single center. 6. Perhaps unknown to Hayek, everything is directed from a single center, the amorphous composition of this fluttering phenomenon we call capital, from which all things relate and to a great extent are determined. More troubling is how not only does all economic activity stem from the center but also moves towards a central goal. This goal being the acquisition of a profit, the reproduction of the circuit of capital, wherein the cycle starts again and the endless drive to accumulate is extended. Therefore Hayek's appeal to the individuality of his readers against this boogeyman of a planned economy retains its own despicable irony. Nothing could be more damaging to the individual and her expression than the burgeoning march of capital, and history has constantly demonstrated this. The question of socialism then is not one of individualism or collectivism, or myself and the others, but really a fundamental question of the social self. Should we, as workers but more importantly as people, command our own production or not? Should we satisfy our own needs and desires or not? Do we want to be oppressed or self-determined? This might seem to be a massive simplification of the socialist demand, but quite honestly this is the kernel at play: do we affirm ourselves or not? Socialism is not the negation of individuality to the credit of collectivity, but instead the realization of individuality through the affirmation of ourselves. Chapter 4, The Inevitability of Planning. Hayek starts the chapter with a very critical indictment of the Marxist method. As shown in earlier chapters, Hayek promotes a sort of idealism at the loss of a materialist conception of history. Meaning that he decidedly believes ideas are the driving force of history rather than material practices, which is what Marxists highlight in opposition to his sort of idealism. He specifically notes how the trend towards the concentration of capital, monopoly capitalism, is not an inherent process of capitalism but rather a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to the credit of, nominally, socialist ideas. The tendency towards monopoly and planning is not the result of any objective facts beyond our control but the product of opinions fostered and propagated for half a century until they have come to dominate all our policy. 7. A tempting possibility for the liberal to ponder, but simply not true for a number of reasons. First, experience generally precedes theory. When we encounter a phenomena, we seek to describe and recognize the phenomena with a whole sort of significations. However, what is important to note is that the phenomena did exist, at least phenomenologically, bear with me, to the point at which it was discerned. There is some deep philosophical discussion to be had as to the construction of certain events, e.g. the concentration of capital. However, we can remain fairly historically certain these did not occur simply because of the opinions of some nominal progressive policy makers. We can even explain this phenomena and provide cross-cultural examples using the Marxist method. To explain why capital concentrates, tendency towards monopoly, quite briefly we should note the process is inherent to the accumulation of capital itself. Production is driven by the socially necessary labor time. Capitalists who are able to enhance the productivity of their labor process therefore lower the necessary labor time in the production of a commodity, usually through expanding productive means, e.g. equipment, machines, etc., and therefore are able to acquire more of the market. These larger capitalists then acquire the assets of smaller capitalists and again expand their own production. Eventually, smaller capitalists are forced into retreat from these monopolized markets and crowd into spheres of production which modern industry has only sporadically or incompletely got hold of, which is where we find most small businesses today. Therefore, history has shown the concentration of capital to be an objectively certain process of capitalism and to our analysis quite inevitable and independent of any idealist notions of change. Hayek, to his credit, does not simply ignore this knowledge nor give up his original assertion. In fact, he takes our materialist conception of history and the concentration of capital to bat in the following pages. The alleged technological cause of the growth of monopoly is the superiority of the large firm over the small. The most comprehensive study of the facts arrives at the conclusion that the view according to which the greater efficiency of large-scale production is the cause of the disappearance of competition finds scant support in any evidence that is now at hand. 9. Hayek then cites a prominent economic report at his time detailing how the concentration of capital was due to collusive agreement and promoted by public policies. 10. There is a bit of truth to be found in Hayek's assertion, so it's important to take our time analyzing the selected material. First, the study he utilizes was, even at the time, ill-equipped for any real comprehensive and comparative analysis of firms. The temporary National Economic Committee which he cites only analyzed the relative success of large firms to small firms in select markets. Ignoring the fact, of course, that even Marx admitted there were certain markets wherein small capitalists could take refuge. These markets are where the competition rages, where the consumer base is more important than the disciplined productivity of a large firm. However, the analysis given is almost laughably one-sided. Where is the analysis of small capitalists in the steel industry, or the oil industry, or the textile industry? That is where the large productive capacity of monopoly capitalists comes to full fruition as they sweep smaller competition through sheer force. More modern economic analysis has shown, perhaps intuitively so, that larger firms are always better equipped in competition with smaller capitalists. The reason is even more expanded than that initially provided by Marx, with the socially necessary labor time being commanded by larger capitalists. In addition to their ability to discipline productivity, monopoly capitalists can negotiate preferable finance deals, acquire more specialized labor power, and invest more capital into labor power reproduction. All of which gives them a substantial edge over small capitalists, no matter how driven, innovative, or enterprising they are. Big money beats small money in big fields. On an off point, Hayek also argues that if concentration were inevitable, we should have seen it occur faster in the older industrial nations such as England, but instead it occurred most noticeably in the United States. However, this makes perfect sense from the analysis provided by Marxists. The concentration of capital is hardly mechanical, but certainly determined more by the rate and liquidity of accumulation than the duration of development. The tremendous amount of foreign investment from Europe into fresh markets within the US allowed for the remarkable expansion of industrial capitalists as they gobbled up stakes. Smaller capitalists in the US, unable to secure that bountiful investment, faded very quickly and left the most lucrative markets to a handful of ultra-wealthy massive firms which only grew quicker. The situation in England was starkly different, with no real spatial room for growth and only trickling foreign investment. Industrial capital had a very uphill climb, which explains why the concentration took so much longer to advance, although now it's certainly apparent the process wasn't fatally hindered. A more modern example would be the explosion of monopoly firms within India, which only very recently began industrializing. India, like all other growing industrial powers today, has the whole world market of foreign investment and liquidity to quickly develop capitalism and all the processes therein. Second, the presence of collusive agreements between big capitalists and the state is hardly any surprise to a Marxist. After all, the bourgeois state is the bourgeois state. It is there to serve the bourgeoisie. None of which casts doubt on the truth value of the Marxist method. If anything, our understanding of history and society is only reaffirmed by the presence of such collusion. Some might then ask, is the concentration of capital a consequence of internal contradictions within accumulation, or the simple subservience of the state to the bourgeoisie? For our purposes with debunking Hayek here, it really makes no difference. Both processes are arguably equally intrinsic to capitalism, therefore it makes no difference how it occurs. Concentration of capital is imminent. However, for point of technical clarification, we should note that this concentration is likely reinforced by both processes, but principally through the internal contradictions in accumulation. Even without the collusion between big capitalists and their state actors, monopolies would spring up in markets for the reasons already given. Yet, the bourgeois state in capitalism has always acted to develop and protect capitalism without any real exception to be noted. Even in the case of picking losers, the action extends the social whole. It should be expected that the superstructure would act back upon the base to help resolve those contradictions which might impede overall development. Hayek goes on to make several claims to the superiority of competitive markets and the price system as opposed to a planned economy. However, we should not spend too much time on these claims in specific, as much more accomplished experts in these fields have disproved so much of Hayek's assertions. For example, Paul Coxhott, Ph.D., and Alan Cottrell, Ph.D., in their published report Economic Planning, Computers, and Labor Values, thoroughly demonstrated how an entire economy could be planned more effectively than anything existing today using real-time data feeds and labor values in place of standard pricing. 11. Although Hayek does make several correct claims with regard to certain policy makers suggesting a more centralized approach to developing capitalism, for example, with the chartering of corporations in the United States. However, this does not build his argument on behalf of his idealism nor to the credit of any free market system. Rather, what he is highlighting is a conscious example of what was mentioned earlier with regard to the superstructure intervening in the progression of the base. What certain policy makers realized is that to effectively develop capitalism and extend their own tentacles, they have to overcome, or at least attempt to overcome, the contradictions which riddle the normal development of capitalism. This conscious development of capitalism of course retains all of the exploitation and oppression endemic to the system, but in a very pragmatic and remarkably human sense. Take for example the development of capitalism within China over the past 30 years. No doubt, the Chinese mainland has developed their productive capacity in a way rarely seen in history, but has done so with a more clear sense of direction. The Communist Party of China continually remarks that the development of market mechanism will enhance the living standards of their massive population even as they are submerged deeper into the workings of exploitation and circulation. How is this possible? To use a metaphor, it's easier to paddle when everyone is on board. And that is exactly how modern capitalist imperialism has developed to later stages, by reinforcing the idea that everyone is on board. Public-private joint ventures, public development with private investment, private ecological initiatives, big capitalists supporting the maintenance of smaller capitalists, think GE community investment, etc. These are all conscious efforts by the thoughtful, read, conscious capital, elements of the capitalist class to maintain their own domination and advancement, even if this means nominal concessions. None of which builds upon Hayek's argumentation. More than socialism, Hayek misunderstands the reality of capitalism. All of his quaint rhetoric is nothing more than a rosy fairy tale not even the capitalist class is willing to entertain. By observing the actual development of capitalism, we have discovered that the ability to change form while deepening substance is the only chance capitalism has at prolonging its own existence. Public policy makers who advocate centralized development are not socialists. Not even in the soft usage of the term. They are fundamentally the most profound capital advocates in existence. More so than the charlatan spinsters such as Hayek and other free market prophets. Arguably, FDR did more for capitalism than Adam Smith ever could. Chapter 5, Planning and Democracy. The point of this chapter is to prove that planning could never fully satisfy the desires of every individual under the plan and is therefore insufficient in the realm of social governance. In classic Hayek fashion, he makes a collection of assertions to supplement this point, although none of them are particularly convincing. Regardless, we will go about destroying every relevant assertion as it makes its appearance through the text. He begins with rhetoric very similar sounding to that of previous chapters, already addressed. The common features of all collectivist systems may be described, in a phrase ever dear to socialists of all schools, as the deliberate organization of the labors of society for a definite social goal. 12-100. Such as the production of commodities or the realization of a profit. Though, one would be hard-pressed to find Hayek admitting that capitalism could be anything but a form of collectivism in and of itself. In addition, we should make very clear that usage of terms such as collectivism is hardly founded in anything meaningful. The usage of terms should be revealing to the reader, not concealing, and with such vague terminology employed one can only imagine that Hayek has no intention of revealing anything at all. The various kinds of collectivism differ from liberalism and individualism in wanting to organize the whole of society and all its resources for this unitary end, and in refusing to recognize the autonomous spheres in which the ends of the individuals are supreme. In short, they are totalitarian in the true sense of this new word which we have adopted to describe the unexpected but nevertheless inseparable manifestations of what in theory we call collectivism. 13-100. Let's make a few points, given as this is a rather central theme to the entire text. 1. As stated innumerable times, Hayek makes an arbitrary distinction between the variants of society he calls collectivism and whatever sort of society he would consider capitalism. At the end of the day, all societies since the beginning of civilization have at least one thing in common: they are class societies. So common is this knowledge that when referring to society we are already referring to something which is divided, stratified, and wholly separate from the individual and to itself. Feudalism was a class society dominated by the feudal class, the monarch, landed aristocracy, their vassals, the clergy, etc. Capitalism is a class society dominated by the bourgeoisie, the industrial capitalists, bankers, investors, businessmen, their professionals, etc. Socialism is still a class society, however it is moving towards classlessness, or what we refer to as communism. Ultimately, the point to be made is that Hayek's division is arbitrary and with a material conception of history in mind, seems ridiculous. 2. What are these autonomous spheres in which the ends of the individuals are supreme? Once again we find Hayek taking vague refuge in the promise of some not yet articulated humanism, e.g. the banal conception of individuality as being without. Apparently, one can only be an individual when one is in some mythical social existence where everyone else does not matter. Furthermore, Hayek provides no concrete reasoning as to why one could not be in these autonomous zones while living in a socialist society. Keep in mind, we define socialism only as what it fundamentally is, a society on its way to classlessness. 3. Hayek's usage of totalitarian is also problematic. What makes something totalitarian? Better yet, what makes socialism totalitarian? The idea of a planned economy. Forgetting that the capitalist economy is already planned by a handful of corporations on behalf of the rich. The combined determination of society. forgetting that capitalism is collectively determined, by the ruling class, the owning class, for their own purposes. The wrongly held belief that hard work will not be rewarded. Because the hard work of single mothers, sweatshop workers, and child slaves is surely rewarded in an equitable society such as capitalism. Oftentimes it's difficult to even fathom the full regime of control exerted by capitalism onto the unaware individual. Everything we do surrounds this all-powerful piece of paper which represents everything material and representable. Our lives hang in the balance of some numbers dancing across a screen. All of which only examines one narrow dynamic of oppression in relation to capitalism, the full totality of which, including those webs of oppression not entirely capitalist but integrated, such as patriarchy, are hardly something we could ever measure. Yet, Hayek will go about claiming it is the liberation from capitalism which is the true totalitarianism. What nonsense! Hayek then argues that a planned economy, at this point the reader should substitute this phrase with socialism, is incompatible with human civilization because it presupposes, in short, the existence of a complete ethical code in which all the different human values are allotted their due place. 14101. Once again, Hayek demonstrates a very shallow understanding of human society as a whole. First, morality, like culture, is constructed/created/conjured forth from the host of material practices which sustain a society. While human society is best seen as an organic whole, to account for the sheer intricacy and interrelation, Marx draws a divergence between the base and superstructure, or the material practices which fundamentally sustain the society, e.g. production, and the social practices built around that, e.g. culture. This helps us account for the cross-cultural similarities, but also differences, at points such as morality, values, etc. Importantly, we must understand that the certain cultural understandings an individual possesses are not some inescapable extension of her person, however material oppression can still be built, quite easily, around culture as well, but constructions which can be augmented and quite often are. Therefore, we should not worry about balancing essential human values from one person to another to find the perfect formula for everyone. Values, like morality, are socially conditioned and constructed, and any socialist society would go about like societies before it, transforming these values accordingly. However, this is not some cultish advertisement for social engineering. In fairness, the engineering is already being done. Perhaps not in the way sci-fi fans would imagine, however, the totality of human thought and behavior is constantly being conditioned, molded, and reproduced by the cultural outputs which surround us. Every television show, magazine, video game, song, and book is providing some sort of social narrative, something more powerful and constructive than any futuristic or sadistic mind control nonsense. Even the way in which we speak is riddled with implicated signifiers which exude a mode of normalcy which defines how we understand everything around us. To put it quite simply, Hayek's different human values are essentially humanistic nonsense. This does not mean socialism would require the same regimes of control or that individuals would not be free to explore different human values, if we understand that they are indeed exploring and not embodied. However, this exploration and configuration would be entirely different in that the base of exploitation and material oppression, the capitalist relations of production, patriarchy, national oppression, etc., would be eliminated. Therefore, the human values realized thereafter capitalism might actually be considered human values in the full sense that they would no longer be based on a system of exploitation but the subjective life affirmation of that individual. Ultimately, no complete moral code is required for the planning of an economy, success of socialism, or abolition of capitalism. Hayek continues ranting about the lack of any such complete moral code and extends upon the defeated arguments listed above until finally arriving at the question of democracy with regard to economic planning. Here he makes himself a home and begins a very long and terribly boring explanation as to why democracy and central economic planning are incompatible. His essential thesis through the pages is: 1. People do not really know what they want. 2. Their representatives cannot accurately represent them. 3. There can be no full agreement, ergo someone is giving up something. 4. There is no real efficient way of dividing these democratic tasks to accomplish the planning. 5. This planning democracy gives way to economic dictators. Allow us to go about debunking these vital points for the sake of brevity and a concise explanation for the reader. 1. Hayek consistently makes usage of this idea of limitless wants as an impeding factor in the effective planning of an economy, let alone the democratic method of planning. However, he forgets, or simply ignores, that wants are not intrinsic but given. There was no limitless want for computers before Microsoft or Happy Meals before McDonald's. A democratically planned economy would not be entirely concerned with these unrealized wants, which are surely a social construction. The presentation of new wants could come about organically through the free innovation of anyone interested and later integrated, perhaps. The main concern of any democratic planning body would be to satisfy the needs of everyone concerned. Such a task is far more feasible, predictable, and, as mentioned earlier, refer to P. Cockshot's work, possible with current technology. Ultimately, if Walmart and McDonald's can safely plan the demand of most consumers, one would hope that the collective intellectual, technological, and material resources of humanity could plan and provide for their own physical needs. 2. This is more nonsense speculation on behalf of Hayek. He makes references to failed reformist socialists in Western Europe but misses the point of their failure. Working within the bourgeois forms of representation will certainly offer nothing substantial to the oppressed and exploited. It is for this reason that representatives and their bodies of representation will be of an entirely new type that satisfies the organic desire of the masses. It is certainly arguable that even past experiences in socialism, such as the USSR and PRC, overcame this obstacle through radical forms of democracy which gave all power to the people. 3. Once again, more baseless assertions and speculation. When most of the useless smoke and mirrors of capitalism is done away with, commodity production is eliminated, and the masses are liberated, its unlikely individuals will be distraught over realizing their needs like some sort of Amazon shopping cart. The productive capacity will be transformed to the point where everyone's needs will be accounted for, certainly with room for satisfying those life-affirming cultural desires. 4. Bourgeois parliament or Congress will have little in common with bodies of real proletarian power. As previous socialist experiments have shown us, these bodies are insufficient in their ability to both represent the real demands of the people and efficiently deliver those demands. It would be entirely fruitless to speculate how tasks might be divided in these democratic bodies. However, we work with the simple knowledge that the liberated creativity of the masses will carry humanity through these stages of socialism. What we should really be wary of is those who doubt the potential of the masses. Such doubt and skepticism of the people usually breeds the right opportunism, which eventually tanks real bodies of proletarian power. 5. It is doubtful that any economic dictator under socialism could be worse than your average CEO today. In socialism, labor power ceases to be a commodity that is simply bought and sold between bidders, capitalists. The organized and collective power of the workers stands a much better chance of mitigating any possible abuse on behalf of some technical planning bureaucrat or authoritarian elected leader. Furthermore, real socialism incorporates the shared administration of the planned economy by every willing individual, which actively works to combat any possible avenues of economic autocracy. Although nothing is given for sure, we work with the combined experience of previous failed experiments and all that we understand better now. Ultimately, we must trust the possibility of our own liberation over the certainty of our present oppression. In the end, Hayek is simply casting doubt on the possibility of a successful liberation by criticizing proletarian or progressive democracy. He is not, however, questioning the actual predicament, which is the exploitation and class struggle within capitalism. The idea is not to have some perfect working blueprint of democracy within socialism. One could argue that the Jacobins, among other bourgeois radicals, had little understanding of how a bourgeois democracy would actually work, as if we could run computer models of liberation or something of the sort, when their respective monarchies came to an end. The question is not whether democracy in socialism can work, the point is that it must work because what exists now is neither democratic nor acceptable. When the masses come to power, they will develop the necessary apparatuses for the maintenance of their own dominance, similar to all significant social revolutions of the past. Speculating upon technical specifics at this point demonstrates nothing but cynicism on behalf of those who doubt the people. Do we trust the future of liberation? If not, we can always settle for our certain and definite oppression within the status quo. Debunking Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Economic Planning and Totalitarianism, Part 3. Chapter 6, Planning and the Rule of Law. As the title would suggest, Hayek begins Chapter 6 by promoting what he refers to as the rule of law. While many legal and political interpretations exist of the rule of law, Hayek importantly draws distinction between his version of this law and what he calls arbitrary government. He goes on to provide a fairly concise explanation of what he means at the most basic level. Stripped of all technicalities, this means that government in all its actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and to plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. 1. Essentially, what Hayek is describing is more than simply the rule of law in the strict legal sense, that all would be bound by some sort of common law established in some collective manner. He is describing the sort of fundamental legality required in the course of market interaction. If we refer to the orthodox understanding of Marxist political economy, wherein society and its institutions are loosely categorized as within the base or superstructure, Hayek is highlighting the superstructural norms which act back upon the base and its development. Specifically, the intermediary power of the state both in the normal functioning of capital accumulation as well as the resolution between contradictions among different elements of the base. He then makes his case against planning of the collectivist kind by explaining how the two, planning and the rule of law, are in opposition. The planning authority cannot confine itself to providing opportunities for unknown people to make whatever use of them they like. In the end, somebody's views will have to decide whose interests are more important, and these views must become part of the law of the land, a new distinction of rank which the coercive apparatus of government imposes upon the people. 2. He continues to expand upon his initial argument here. However, we should make a few important points before continuing. 1. Hayek is constructing a few important false dichotomies to assist his argumentation in this chapter. The first is that between the neutrality of the rule of law and this hypothetical planning authority, which he conveniently substitutes for anything that is not his preferred model of liberal governance. There is no such neutrality in the rule of law. The law is established to maintain a certain social order. None of this analysis is explicitly Marxist either. It is simply common knowledge that this historically established law, whatever it may be, is politically composed according to some material condition and/or ideological insight which is of course considered publicly understood. Therefore, it makes no sense to draw distinction between the rule of law and somebody's views, at least when examined closer. The law is somebody's views. The question we must then ask is whose? The views of the ruling class. The views of the exploiters and oppressors, the elites, the reactionaries, and their allies, at least in the case of bourgeois society. The second dichotomy he constructs, albeit this one being more subtle and nurtured throughout the book, is the dichotomy between the coercive apparatus of government and the coercive apparatus of private capital. Of course, there is a distinction to be made, and a very important distinction at that. The distinction, however, is found in the social relations both are involved in and to some level reproduce. Yet, both exist within the same totality of capitalist imperialism. More importantly, both to one degree or another, through one form or another, reproduce the status quo and the social order in which we all live. Therefore, to say on the one hand the coercive apparatus of government is the boogeyman while the same function performed by private industry is liberty or the free exercise of individuals is nonsense. Both are coercive, however to different ends, but oppressive nonetheless. If we are able to deconstruct this false dichotomy, we can truly realize the full scope of our own social involvement with apparatuses which serve to deny us, and suppress the revolutionary subject. 2. There is no conceivable reason that any socialist society would have to limit the opportunities of individuals. In fact, even the failed socialist experiments of the Soviet Union and China offered great personal freedom to everyone, especially those marginalized by bourgeois society, women, ethnic minorities, nationally oppressed, etc. What sort of opportunities could thus be limited by a socialist society, at least in the world of Hayek? In actuality, what Hayek is referring to with his colorful use of buzzwords like opportunity is the systematized exploitation of the many by the few property holders. The opportunity for the capitalist to extract surplus value from his workers and to hold this profit as a weapon against the working class. The opportunity for the unemployed and hungry worker to seek out destructive employment and exploitation simply to reproduce his own livelihood, or what remains of it. If these are the opportunities Hayek wants to preserve, then we should question what, if any, relevance his notion of freedom should pertain to the common person. 3. We should not shy away from deciding whose interests are more important. As communists, we have already made a profound statement on this matter. The interests of the working class, of the masses, of the oppressed and exploited, of the people should be defended and promoted against their enemies, the ruling class, compradors, misogynists, racists, chauvinists, homophobes, and transphobes. We should not beat around the bush on this issue. However, we should note a few important theoretical points as well. First, the liberal rule of law has already decided whose interests are more important, the interests of the ruling class and all those listed whom the rule of law actively protects. The struggle is not a one-way street. It is actively waged by all forces concerned, including those dominant ruling forces against the oppressed. Furthermore, through the construction of a socialist society, a society on the route to statelessness and classlessness, the distinction between interests will gradually be closed. Classes will dissipate, nations will dissipate, and the social relevance of difference which necessitates the opportunity cost, as mentioned by Hayek, will be no more. Not as though people will not be different, or have different life pursuits, or personal interests, etc. However, these differences are not power relations in and of themselves, such as the differences between nations, classes, and genders today. As mentioned earlier, Hayek extends his argument onto the next page, specifically detailing what he believes the function of government serves in promoting this rule of law. He argues the formal establishment of a framework, which was debunked in the previous part, is merely instrumental to free exercise of individuals, read, capitalists. Additionally, he asserts that this social order allows us greater foresight and results than conscious control. The argument is twofold. The first is economic. The state should confine itself to establishing rules applying to general types of situations and should allow individuals freedom in everything, because only the individuals concerned in each instance can fully know these circumstances and adapt their actions to them. The second, moral or political, argument is even more directly relevant to the point under discussion. If the state is precisely to foresee the incidence of its actions, it means that it can leave those affected no choice. It is also the state which chooses between the different ends. To be impartial means to have no answer to certain questions. 3. As consistently shown when Hayek makes mention of individuals, he is speaking specifically of the capitalist class as personified in its most ideological representation, the enterprising individual. The framework he mentions is simply the status quo, albeit perhaps an idealistically modified version. However, this framework is still nothing more than the formal legitimization and presentation of exploitative relations as something other than themselves. Beyond this, Hayek makes a somewhat pragmatic appeal to the decentralized action of the market. The individual, within her own circumstances, should grasp the most correct route of action better than some abstract planning authority. At the surface, this point seems reasonable, and there is a kernel of truth to what is being said, when re-articulated away from liberal bourgeois sentiments. It's true, the lowest and most integrated sections of the masses often understand their own circumstances better than anyone else. Furthermore, we would trust the testimony of someone living in these circumstances over someone who is not. Therefore, when drafting up any economic plan, the concrete experiences of the masses, the individuals within their own circumstances, are given a special precedence over the abstract musings of bureaucrats or officials. This is not a utopian measure either, but actually how most economic plans in the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China were drawn up, from the bottom up, with special consideration for the experiences of the masses. However, any socialist economic plan must be a common plan, a la Marx, and therefore not simply the accumulated demands of every different individual. The plan must uniquely synthesize the needs, desires, and experiences of the masses, the expertise of the planning authority, as well as allot adequate resources for continuing productive development. This is why we must remember that every individual works with an imperfect knowledge of the social instance at hand. What the individual doesn't know can be supplemented by the synthesis of experience from other individuals, productive units, and the planning authority itself. This allows for the most rational allocation of resources. Therefore, the common plan not only pragmatically establishes a conscious construction of socialism but provides the ideological mechanisms for the continued education of a communist subject. The moral argument provided by Hayek is simply nonsense. The crux of his argument being that unconscious market mechanisms do not pick winners and losers, and therefore there is no risk of unfairly favoring party over another. True, the market as a mediation of social relations is quite different from mediation through fidelity, land, etc. in previous modes of production, but not without some inherent inequalities, to say the least. What about favoring the capitalist class over the working class? What about the prevalence of bourgeois right over labor? What about the unique qualities of private property as dominant? There are endless moral presuppositions taken within the capitalist market which forever choose the capitalists, exploiters and oppressors, as favorable to those they employ, exploit and oppress. Therefore, to make qualms with the foresight of the state as being morally questionable is complete nonsense. You must compare that plausibility with the current social order if you mean to make any meaningful moral objection, which Hayek cannot do. As far as bias in who the state supports, we already clarified whose interests would be dominant in a socialist society, with not a shred of apologism therein. There is no such thing as an impartial state when the very purpose of the state is the maintenance of a specific social order, or the interests thereof. Drawing distinction between the impartial liberal state and the moral collectivist state, Hayek then claims that Nazi Germany was an example of a state forcing morality for. The irony here is that the sort of morality exuded by Nazi Germany was very characteristic of capitalist imperialist nations of the time. The entire socio-political presentation by the Nazis was one focused on progress with respect for upholding traditions. The traditional, conservative and capitalist, relations of production and social values were promoted, including a thick sense of national chauvinism and masculinity, both in culture and production. What more could Hayek and his contemporaries desire? However, this is not the only comparison Hayek desperately draws between socialists and Nazis. As stated many times before, this is a classic tactic of liberals and apologists for capitalism. Why engage the merits of socialist theory when you can draw vague comparisons to something considered universally horrific? His comparison in the following pages concerns the Nazis' disregard for the German rule of law and demands for substantive justice in and above the universal application of the Law 5. What he fails to mention is that even before these pseudo-populist pleas by the Nazis, they were gaining significant traction as a political party using the framework already established. It was only after the fact that the Nazis could attempt to enforce this substantive justice they had in mind. Although, we should once again stress that any similarities between the Nazis and contemporary socialists are completely superficial at best. One group wants to eliminate disparities and promote a meaningful equality, the other wants to exploit existing inequalities to legitimize further disparities, white supremacism. Even the means by which to achieve these goals are entirely different, and therefore any comparison between the two is complete nonsense, as was specifically outlined in the analysis of previous chapters. Nearing the end of the chapter, Hayek makes a case against using the word privilege to describe private property, assumedly among other features of the bourgeois legality. Once again he denounces what he terms substantive justice as culpable for the disdain of property. The conflict between formal justice and formal equality before the law, on the one hand, and the attempts to realize various ideals of substantive justice and equality, on the other, also accounts for the widespread confusion about the concept of privilege and its consequent abuse. To mention only the most important instance of this abuse, the application of the term privilege to property as such. 6. Before allowing him to begin his argument against the usage of the term, we should highlight briefly why this usage, of privilege, is so important. As pointed out by Hayek, the established forms of law and ideas of justice are in competition with those opposing forms of law and ideas of justice which may or may not be revolutionary. In the case of Marxism and the rising tide of social revolution, these new forms of law and justice offer a meaningful challenge to the existing bourgeois order. The very identity and characteristics of such new forms are found in the very conflict they materialize and extend with, and within, the status quo. Therefore, when the term privilege is used to describe something such as property, there is a very important social space opened within discourse. Now, what was previously legitimized or even upheld as virtuous is drawn into question as something to be criticized, such as the feudal privilege of the 19th century. Bourgeois right being identified as privilege threatens the narrative as presented by the liberals, and thus Hayek immediately criticizes this usage, especially against property, as an abuse. It would indeed be privilege if, for example, as has sometimes been the case in the past, landed property were reserved to members of the nobility. And it is privilege if, as is true in our time, the right to produce or sell particular things is reserved to particular people designated by authority. But to call private property as such, which all can acquire under the same rules, a privilege, because only some succeed in acquiring it, is depriving the word privilege of its meaning. 7. Already we see Hayek criticizing previous forms of privilege in his comment towards the members of the nobility. However, he seems unable to connect the dots regarding institutionalized forms of privilege and class power within our own society. Being born into a propertied class is indeed a privilege. Living off the exploitation of others is indeed a privilege. Enjoying a decadent and wholly opulent lifestyle while others are left to scrounge for an existence is indeed a privilege. How could it be anything but? Hayek tries to dismiss this with his claim that, regarding private property, all can acquire under the same rules. Some soft socialists might even agree, but then point out that not everyone will, for systemic reasons. However, this appraisal does not go far enough. Not every even can acquire private property, no matter the hypothetical used when comparing it to the actual functioning of capitalism. Capitalism, and to a greater extent even, imperialism, is built upon the social division of labor. There are some who perform wage labor, there are some who perform the lowest forms of wage labor, there are some who perform labor outside the normal circulation of capital, and there are those who reap the benefits. If everyone could acquire private property, if everyone could establish a means by which to exploit another, the entire system would fall apart. The normal accumulation of capital requires a limited amount of capitalists with a fluctuating body of labor power to be employed. If everyone had their own means of production, as grossly hypothetical as this is growing, capitalism would cease to exist, considering the entire system is built upon the circulation of capital, which requires exploitation, in the most orthodox usage of the term. Theoretically speaking, if Hayek were correct, then capitalism would no longer exist. On an entirely pragmatic level, Hayek speaks romantic nothings about the advent of the enterprising individual. If we examine his statement closely, we find that no one plays under the same rules. No one is in the same circumstances. No one's livelihood is predominantly determined by their ingenuity. No one stands a chance against the established monopolists and the modern transnational capitalist class. Let's provide a quick example before moving on. The GNI per capita in the United States is $53.670, while in Mexico it is $9.940. Statistical analysis isn't needed to deduce the average Mexican is enjoying a whole lot less income than the average American. And for what reason? Obviously, the combined and uneven development of capitalism into imperialism over the last century. To put it plainly, the monopolists of the global north alongside the comprador bourgeoisie of Mexico, among other peripheral and semi-peripheral nations, benefit from the super-exploitation and or specified underdevelopment of oppressed nations. How does the enterprising individual stand against such forces? It's just utter nonsense, and at the very least a disgusting romanticization of the power relations at play in capitalism-imperialism. Some apologists for capitalism might argue that the uneven plane developed, and exacerbated, over the last few centuries is entirely due to historically constituted systems prior to capitalism, and those which persist are due to a disinterest in free markets and the rule of law. There is a reason we refer to such arguments as apologism, starting of course from the presumption that modern neoliberal capitalism offers nothing but benevolent and inclusive development for the whole of humanity. The problem is that any such disinterest has also been socially developed in opposition to the colonial and post-colonial, and neocolonial, paradigm established for the developing world, wherein the global north enriches itself over the selectively established markets within the global south. Corruption and a disregard for the rule of law is on one level a deceptive appraisal, and on the other hand a conveniently noted construction. First, it is not as though this corruption is not beneficial for the ruling compradors and the monopolists they stand in alliance with. Corrupt ministers, regulators, and officials are cultivated parallel to these exploitative relationships which provide no accountability, as a pretext to a nation with no real sovereignty. Secondly, the international standard of law is enforced by the global north generally with selective intervention from more transnational bodies. This means that the law which is established has historically been imposed on developing nations as a condition of continued development, red, neoliberalism. Therefore any such remark which highlights the subjective phenomena internal to an oppressed nation, without understanding its context as an oppressed nation, should be entirely disregarded as a red herring. Hayek finishes the chapter by restating arguments he made in previous chapters regarding the incompatibility of individual rights with a planned economy. He intensifies his re-articulation through examples of restricted movement and communication within the Soviet Union, and compares this to the rhetoric of rather liberal soft socialists who commented on the issue, not specifically the Soviet Union, but abstractly. 9. Despite this rather uninspiring mash-up of experience and rhetoric, Hayek finishes the chapter in a different light. In this respect much more consistency is shown by the more numerous reformers who, ever since the beginning of the socialist movement, have attacked the metaphysical idea of individual rights and insisted that in a rationally ordered world there would be no individual rights but only individual duties. 10. It's somewhat humorous Hayek chooses to put metaphysical in quotation as if the ideological imposition of individual rights could be anything but an appeal to the metaphysical. Regardless, what he is actually describing is a fundamental transformation in how individual rights are conceived as being within the stage of socialist construction en route to communism. Although, his description carries a negative connotation with it and his gut-wrenching remarks on individual duties, you can almost imagine him grimacing at the thought. The actual transformation is one which has occurred several times throughout the history of human development, and understandably so within the future phase of socialism. For example, during the Middle Ages the rights of the individual were starkly determined by their relationship to the feudal order at the time, specifically the church. Furthermore, the entire conception of the individual was something rare outside the realm of atomized duty to the familial feudal order of production/reproduction. Following the formal collapse of feudalism and shallow introduction of bourgeois ideals, this concept of the individual and his rights were reshaped and conditioned by new relations of production. This is a rather orthodox appraisal but acceptable for the sake of brevity. Therefore, It's only intuitive to think that the whole network of ideas and understandings regarding individual rights and how they function will transform in accordance with the new communist relations of production following the construction of socialism. This is not by any means a bad thing or something to be held in contempt. Certainly any transformation which accompanies a world historic shift towards liberation and equality cannot be worse than what we have now, no. Obviously the reader can form her own thoughts on this, now, hypothetical phenomena, but understanding the historic necessitation of such processes is important to forming a critical understanding of even those detractors such as Hayek. However, it should be stated, as has been stated before, that any conceivable loss of individual rights would be those specifically of the oppressing class. The individual right to discriminate, to exclude, to exploit, to dominate. All of which would be necessarily done away with in transition to communism, and of course existing rights modified to satisfy the desires and needs of the broad masses in their first taste of freedom. Hayek wants his readers to feel an attachment to their values at hand. God, freedom, country, and the whole lot. We want our readers, and his, to understand the concrete development of these values as values. We want to illuminate these paths of development and the way in which they sit now, so that these inner workings of power/property/ and stratification become as intelligible as possible. It is this intelligibility of our social circumstances, the ways in which we relate to our material reality and structures of domination, which allow for any meaningful agency to exist. Only then can any critical understanding be formed. Only then can these old values be tossed away. Only then can new and emancipatory values be formed. Chapter 7, Economic Control and Totalitarianism. The crux of this chapter is not all too dissimilar from previous installments. The point emphasized by Hayek is the centrality of economic control to the whole social existence of the individual. He argues that any pragmatic application of socialist planning must be authoritarian in nature and therefore engenders a totalitarian aspect to the whole concept, wherein, the economic planner, the boogeyman of all liberal writings, assumes absolute control over the livelihood of the common people. He makes his case most explicitly in the first page of the chapter. Most planners who have seriously considered the practical aspects of their task have little doubt that a directed economy must be run on more or less dictatorial lines. Power must rest in the hands of a commander-in-chief whose actions must not be fettered by democratic procedure. 11. Let's make a few points to fully demolish this conception. 1. As stated numerous times over, any comparison between this supposed hypothetical economic tyranny must account for similar conditions within the status quo. Hayek, of course, starts from the presumption of absence, that there is no substantive economic tyranny already, and therefore goes about drawing these colorful hypothetical/doom sayings and all that entails. Our current system is already characterized by a high level of centralism within the economic realm. The concentration of corporate powers over the last century has relegated small businesses and petty capital to markets where they are still somewhat competitive, a la Marx. But even disregarding the centralism and heavy economic tyranny of our contemporary era, we should recall this as being intrinsic to the historical development of capitalism, even within the period of competitive capitalism, which was the primary study of orthodox Marxism in the 19th century. The tendency towards monopolization and hostile market tactics was apparent. 2. Capitalism itself is dependent upon this sort of economic commander-in-chief, and furthermore the entire attitudinal performances which follow suit. As highlighted by Marx, capitalists, but not only capitalists, their managerial heads as well, function as stand-ins for the circulation of capital. Those directors of the mad and speculative dance which defines everything in the global circulation of value. These individuals are indispensable to the very existence of capitalism, not they themselves as in existing and unique individuals, but they themselves as a category of social agents within the structure. The CEOs, the corporate officers, the stockholders, the managers, these people are inherent to the very structural maintenance of the capitalist system, and without them the system cannot exist, at least not in a functional sense. Their position and all of the decadence and excess is something which is absolutely necessitated within the status quo and arguably any manifestation of capitalism. Therefore, for Hayek to draw attention to a hypothetical socialist economic dictator reflects only the highest levels of cognitive dissonance and or stinging hypocrisy. We already have economic dictators. Those prized and revered enterprising individuals become the plutocrats of a degenerate and merciless social system. They are the ones making lucrative deals to enrich themselves and their cronies at the expense of others. They are the ones sending unemployment notices and cutting workers' benefits. Quite literally, life and death hang upon their whims. 3. There is no conceivable reason that a planned socialist economy could not incorporate a dynamic and fluid democratic process. The technology which already exists enables working people to give their input on circumstances pertaining to their livelihoods via social media, networking, and instant messaging. How could this not be retooled or reorganized to serve a constructive and socialist purpose? So that the same communicative pathways could be used to enrich and empower everyday people? The barrier to such constructive interaction is of course the current economic regime of domination, which is thoroughly a capitalist phenomena. The idea that socialist planning is exclusively something of a managerial task displays a clear lack of creativity and connection to the masses which characterizes bourgeois academia. Something Hayek and other liberal detractors display quite often. He goes on to describe the totalitarian nature of economic planning, concluding that one cannot separate the economic interactions from other social interactions an individual engages in. To some extent we must agree with Hayek here. There is far too much arbitrary separation performed within the study of human interaction. Certainly, such separation of study and analysis allows for more depth across the totality of engagements. However, it could be argued this division also serves an ideological purpose, to detach meaningful subjectivity from the cohesive web it exists for purposes of limiting radical intelligibility. This, of course, is a matter for another time and deserves an investigation in and of itself. Regardless, Hayek's point has a kernel of truth, but this kernel is buried under an exhaustive array of ideological continuities, as the reader will find. The ultimate ends of the activities of reasonable beings are never economic. Strictly speaking, there is no economic motive but only economic factors conditioning our striving for other ends. What in ordinary language is misleadingly called the economic motive means merely the desire for general opportunity, the desire for power to achieve unspecified ends. 12. What Hayek is implying here is something which has been presented by Marxists for the last 150 years. The fact that everything within the sphere of capitalism is mediated by its relationship to capital. The way in which we relate to production/reproduction, as well as the contingencies of circulation, is the predominant relationship which often defines our social interactions as a whole. This is something explained to a far greater extent in a previous article I have written specifically regarding the money form and its significance in everyday life. Within the circuit of capital, the accumulation of money becomes an end in and of itself. Take for example the fundamental expression we use to delineate this process, MCM or money capital money, prime. The circuit begins with money invested in the production of a commodity, purchasing of constant capital and labor power. This same commodity or commodities are then sold and the value is transformed again into the money form, but at a greater quantitative level than what was invested. If we simplify this expression into its basic form, MM, we find that capitalism relies on this basic process of turning less money into more money. Intuitive as this might seem, it is something rather disregarded by neoliberal economists and their predecessors such as Hayek. Why is this disregarded by apologists of capitalism? Precisely for what it reveals about the internal functioning of the system as cohesive whole. In some respect, there is no economic motive precisely because this motive becomes the undifferentiated mediation between all desires. The blind and oftentimes ruthless accumulation of capital becomes a ubiquitous feature of every conceivable social interaction within capitalism. Money is piled up by the monopolists and the transnational capitalist class who sit upon their fortunes for really no other reason than to acquire more. The unapologetic wealth of communication moguls like Carlos Slim is a prime example of this. Hoarding this abstract social value, money, is the imminent and unending goal of the system. This works back to condition future investment, labor power, and everything within the realm of consumption/production/reproduction. Of course, Hayek bridges his original statements into a criticism of economic planning as being totalitarian for the precise reason that nothing is solely economic. Therefore, the economic planner holds a very unique position of power over those who are being planned for, or however that relationship could be expressed. For Hayek, economic planning is not merely a utility of the common good, although he argues this is also despicable, but a regime of control in itself. The question raised by economic planning is, therefore, not merely whether we shall be able to satisfy what we regard as our more or less important needs in the way we prefer. It is whether it shall be we who decide what is more, and what is less important for us, or whether this is to be decided by the planner. 13. To which he summarizes on the following page. Economic control is not merely control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest, it is the control of the means for all our ends. 14. Hayek is absolutely correct. He provides fantastic reasoning for any socialist or radical to work consciously towards the abolition of capitalism-imperialism. Confused? Consider this, we are already living within a planned economy. Not only are we living within a planned economy currently, but humanity has resided within this economy for the last 2 centuries, and gradually more of the globe has been brought into the same sphere. Furthermore, we are not dealing with a single totalitarian plan, the coercive desires of some unitary despotic force. Instead we contend with a network of totalitarian plans which define our very existence. The transnational capitalist class, the monopolists, their allies within the comprador strata, command our lives from the heights of the global economy. They promise us shared prosperity, freedom, peace, and general opportunity. But what has this given us? Slavery, subjugation, starvation, genocide, environmental catastrophe, a spectacle of success. Hayek is absolutely correct, economic planning engenders a powerful network of control. We are being controlled by the ruling class who are planning this economy for the enrichment of themselves and their allies, at the incredible and immeasurable loss towards the rest of humanity. Understanding all of this, we find the most profound case for the struggle to socialism. Overthrowing the transnational ruling class seems to be the only way to progress forward ontologically from a state of subjugation to any conceivable sense of an emancipating existence. At the most basic level, socialism hopes to establish relations of production, the way in which people relate to the means of production and to each other, which are not based upon the exploitation of one by another. Wherein, economic planning becomes no longer a network of competing plans for the domination of the earth and humanity, but a coherent and dynamic step towards enriching the social body. Where production no longer serves the purpose of obsolescence, decadence, or bourgeois taste, but the needs and desires of the common person. Where food is not grown to make money, but to nourish the bodies and minds of everyone. Where education is not a privileged and exclusive means to an end but an inclusive space for general advancement. These are just some of the many feats socialism hopes to accomplish, and it is not as though the technological and/or productive capacities are not present. In fact, the productive apparatuses now could well suffice the basic human needs of everyone on the planet. However, capitalism, and the current degenerate form, imperialism, is built upon a rigid and systemic social division which transcends the internal divisions of nations into the realm of oppressed and oppressor blocks. At its most basic level, capitalism is founded upon exclusion, exploitation, and a ubiquitous domination, which is too often more apparent than not. The struggle for socialism is not an ethical imperative based on some lofty or liberal notions from a university. It is found embedded within the experiences of the oppressed and exploited. Recall, as Marx noted, the seeds of destruction, the end of capitalism, lie within the very internal contradictions it cultivates. their intimate understanding of their own social circumstances, including the alienation which is pervasive in every engagement. It's a dynamic struggle not only for such advanced notions but also the most existential dilemmas, including that of material existence, the struggle for survival, the struggle to eat and be free, the struggle to resist the destruction of themselves and their planet. Something Hayek cannot seem to comprehend. If they want to plan, they must control the entry into the different trades and occupations, or the terms of remuneration, or both. In almost all known instances of planning, the establishment of such controls and restrictions was among the first measures taken. The freedom of choice would be purely fictitious. 15. Here Hayek makes another irrelevant and non-unique point. If socialism came about, surely occupational entry would be strictly planned and any freedom of choice on behalf of the student/worker nullified. Quite the opposite, in fact. At the risk of sounding crudely humanistic, everyone seems to have different interests which guide them towards different fields of study. Within socialism, education, higher education especially, would be widely available and entirely free for the individual to cultivate herself. The dynamic and humanly inclusive nature of socialist, emancipated, education would allow those most dedicated to whatever particular field to devote themselves to that study, producing not only well-qualified and technical professionals, but also workers who were truly invested in their field and not simply there for the money as so many are today. Furthermore, the Leninist conception of polytechnic schools would be introduced, but obviously in a modified and parallel form to reflect the transformed values within socialism. Individuals could then cross-train in disciplines as the financial burden of education would cease to persist and would finally be regimented to the full use of society. Will some people have to do certain jobs? Absolutely. Or at least for the early period. But this is something which is incomparable to the stratification which exists in our current system of capitalism imperialism, wherein education is held as a weapon to be used against the masses rather than their fulfillment. Whole swaths of society are left with nothing to do but the most menial, difficult, and low-paying work simply because of the social division of labor established within capitalism. We live in a society where many children are born with almost no opportunity other than to be subjects of minimum wage or the prison industrial complex. This would no longer be the case in socialism, therefore any speculation as to occupational quotas and the like is merely fussing for the sake of apologism. And that is all Hayek and his allies really have in this discursive realm, speculation. For they cannot weigh the observed injustices of capitalism against any concrete alternative such as socialism. They can only speculate from the presumptive notion of absence wherein the current system is a perfectly quaint model for society. Socialism does not speculate. Socialism empowers the working people and oppressed of every sort and variety. Any reasonable individual would conclude, let's first overthrow our oppressors, then consider whether or not freedom is as bad as some say. In their wishful belief that there is really no longer an economic problem, people have been confirmed by irresponsible talk about potential plenty, which, if it were a fact, would indeed mean that there is no economic problem, which makes the choice inevitable. The claim that a planned economy would produce a substantially larger output than the competitive system is being progressively abandoned. They advocate planning no longer because of its superior productivity but because it will enable us to secure a more just and equitable distribution of wealth. This is, indeed, the only argument for planning which can be seriously pressed. 16. His argument here has been at the very least empirically denied. Looking even narrowly at the failed socialist endeavors of the last century, we see quite easily the pragmatic superiority of socialist planning to the anarchy of the market, a la Lenin. In fact, the Soviet Union from 1928 to the mid-1950s experienced some of the most unprecedented economic growth in human history. Going from a backward semi-feudal predicament to rivaling the industrial output of global superpowers such as the United States. The particularities of this development is simply a matter for another time, as there is plenty of criticism to be made regarding the route of socialist construction taken. However, what cannot be denied is the plain efficacy of socialist planning, even loosely socialist and flawed planning, to exceed the growth experienced by the traditional development of capitalism. In respect to today's circumstances, the technical knowledge accumulated would enable socialist planning to enter into realms never experienced in previous experiments, wherein the technological capacity for real-time data feeds and razor-sharp logistics open up previous impossibilities with respect to planning an entire economy. Socialist theorists such as Paul Cox-Hott have even drawn up models wherein the economy could be planned quite efficiently using labor values instead of a socialist accounting like what was utilized in the Soviet Union, and modeled by other nations. Put plainly, a socialist economy could easily surpass the productive output of any neoliberal model, functioning or otherwise. What about this question of potential plenty? With respect to Hayek's speculation, at the time of his writing there was likely not the full understanding of global development or how resources could be allocated to suffice for the entire world. This is not the same today. Already we have significant evidence to believe that there is plenty of food, fresh water, and basic necessities to accommodate the entire world, even at the rate of current population growth. Any inconsistencies could likely be corrected with a redirection of intermediary resources to fulfilling those needs which are more imperative than superfluous consumer goods, finer electronics, niche commodities, etc. Although we are venturing once more into grounds which are more speculative than concrete. What is important to understand is that even the most bourgeois commentators will admit that the systemic inequality we confront is one of our own making, not the immutable restrictions of an external force, e.g. nature. Therefore it's not too presumptive to think that a socialist economy wherein the world's technical expertise is at the disposal of liberation could overcome the incredible material inequality and depravity we confront daily. The question is not one of objective factors impeding the progressive growth and enrichment of humanity, but those subjective factors, primarily those of power relations, which keep the many subjugated to the few. The economic freedom which is the prerequisite of any other freedom cannot be the freedom from economic care which the socialists promise us, and which can be obtained only by relieving the individual at the same time of the necessity and of the power of choice. 17. What power of choice is wielded by the unemployed as they stand in a soup line? What power of choice is wielded by the single mother working double shifts to feed her children? What power of choice is wielded when both options vote for the oppressor? There is always this convenient appeal to the individual power of choice within the rhetoric of Hayek, but never a concrete application of such. He prefers to keep this as abstract as possible so as not to rouse suspicion that everything he is saying is just a colorful romanticization. Perhaps worse than romanticizing these capitalist social relations, he actively obscures the domination at play. The average person has no relative power which can overcome the forces of her oppressor. Therein lies the ruse of it all. This power of choice is the choice between routes which have been preconceived as dead ends. The spaces for substantive action against oppression are always those which are carved from the web and not apparent from within it. Therefore any individual choice which is readily presented by the oppressor should be held with incredible skepticism. To paraphrase so many revolutionaries before, what sort of economic freedom is enjoyed by the hungry and homeless? This turns the entire chapter upon itself. By setting out to show socialism could only be a dismal totalitarianism, he has instead highlighted the totalitarianism we confront daily as subjects within capitalism imperialism. The networks of control have never been more apparent. Our socialist theory is no longer the frightful speculation of old theorists but a legacy of practice/knowledge constituted over centuries by revolutionaries the world over. Capitalism is, on a fundamental level, a system of control. Socialism is the opportunity by which the controlled can challenge their domination. And the practical understanding for socialism to succeed has never been stronger. Chapter 8, Who, Whom? The title for this chapter is a direct allusion to Lenin's famous statement. To paraphrase, freedom by who, for whom? Drawing distinctly upon this historical example, which he confronts directly later in the chapter, Hayek sets out to actually identify and respond to many of the criticisms leveled against capitalism. hedged squarely within the book and derailing an awful multi-chapter train of homogeneous babbling. This chapter is a much-needed breath of fresh air. Obviously, still riddled with liberal apologism, falsehoods, and general inconsistencies, Hayek does not stray too far from the well-traveled paths. However, the actual discussion of capitalism and pending criticisms makes this chapter a much more fulfilling read than the others. He begins by criticizing what he considers the socialist disdain for blindness, as in the perceived impartiality of the free market system. He likens this blindness to the Greek virtues of objectivity and principled detachment, making comparisons between competition in the market and justice. Although competition and justice may have little else in common, it is as much a commendation of competition as of justice that it is no respecter of persons. That it is impossible to foretell who will be the lucky ones and whom disaster will strike, that rewards and penalties are not shared out according to somebody's views about the merits or demerits of different people but depend on their capacity and their luck. 18. The reader is almost baffled by the sheer denial displayed by Hayek, but we will dissect this selection, as it is critical to the development of the chapter, in the usual form. 1. There is some truth to the idea that capitalism is no respecter of persons. As shown before, even those who seem intimately connected to the operation of the system are easily replaced by another director of identical functionality. But this isn't really a reason to engage in some sick admiration of a crookedly impartial system. For there are many points of obvious structural bias which characterize any experience with capitalism, even the most unaware and passive engagements. Furthermore, what is there really to celebrate in human liquidity? Capital commands everything within capitalism. Certainly there is no doubt there. However, when did such subjugation of the human experience to mediation via abstract social functions become admirable? Even the Platonic rhetoric of justice is coherent in a different light than that shed on the free markets. It is this desperate attempt by classical liberalism to eliminate the deviant subjectivity within any social space which even characterizes the archetype of classical liberals today. Their interpretation is the only one visible, therefore these impersonal market factors really do seem blind. 2. Saying capitalism is no respecter of persons is both false and true. Arguably more false and obviously so than true, even. At the most basic level of his premises we find Hayek to be promoting falsehoods. Continuous statistical evidence explains that children who are born poor are more likely to be poor, while children who are born more wealthy or with greater relation to property, generally succeed in similar ways. How shocking! Granted, this is something that Hayek notes in the following pages, although tries to shrug it off academically, but nevertheless we should criticize his quiet assertion of blatant falsehoods. Clearly certain personal qualities are very much respected within capitalism, and trying to rub that away with an appeal to Platonic virtues is just nonsense. 3. On another very basic level we should note the very active repression which is omitted by Hayek. Anyone engaged in radical challenging of the status quo has been a historical target for blacklisting, police terrorism, and general and often state-sponsored aggression. Quite obviously, somebody's views matter a great deal in the realm of the repressive state apparatus, and only so because they had somehow escaped the trappings of the ideological apparatuses, which are arguably far more pervasive. Ask anyone who has been made an object of aggression by this exploitative system whether or not your individual views are significant. None of this even begins to analyze the cultural implications of late capitalism. The media usage of images to construct narratives on otherized bodies, such as the Middle East, Russia, socialism, etc., criminalization, sexualization, objectification, etc. Truly, and with respect to persons there is an infinite array of respect shown to be explored. As referenced earlier, Hayek opens the next page by appealing to the popular sentiments of inequality. He bites some of what he had written earlier and concludes it's not all that unreasonable to consider reducing the social inequality so as to let the blindness of the market do its magic. However, he offers no concrete application of such liberal equalizing and leads that to the romantic speculation of the reader. In reality, there is no liberal route of equalizing which is not simply a rearrangement of the analytic sticks, so to speak. The necessity of a social division of labor renders any attempt, no matter how genuine, functionally obsolete. This doesn't stop Hayek, and he continues by noting the pronounced freedom of the poor. The fact that the opportunities open to the poor in a competitive society are much more restricted than those open to the rich does not make it less true that in such a society the poor are much more free than person commanding much greater material comfort in a different type of society. 19. This is quite ridiculous even at a cursory examination. So, for whatever mystical reason, someone who is poor within capitalism is more free than someone who is more wealthy in a socialist society. Makes no sense at all. Unless of course you can magically monetize or in some way materialize the individual freedom expressed in being sold like a commodity within the competitive markets. Hayek tries to argue the reasoning is that the poor can get rich too. However, as referenced above, this is not even statistically the case. Even if it were, it does not in any way justify the constructed inequalities within capitalism imperialism which perpetuate all hosts of exploitative and dominating relations of production. More or less, the liberal rhetoric here is trying to explain softly the rigid inequalities in capitalism as being not as bad as they seem. And even if they are bad, look, there is this mean old hypothetical socialism where your mystical individual freedom is entirely non-existent. Hardly a compelling argument to the seasoned reader, but certainly a favorite of bourgeois propagandists who dedicate themselves to dispelling any idea of liberation. Again, we should ask ourselves what the local homeless, unemployed, or hungry would have to say regarding this. Now Hayek ventures into territory which is very dangerous to his narrative of our constituted social systems. He tries to address the point leveled by many socialists, including myself, as to the fact that socialism is merely a transfer of power from the exploiting class to the exploited. To believe that the power which is thus conferred on the state is merely transferred to it from others is erroneous. It is a power which is newly created and which in a competitive society nobody possesses. 20. Absolutely false. Here we must smash the liberal narrative in its entirety. As stated by many, the relative power a CEO holds far outweighs that of almost any elected bourgeois official. If economic control confers significant social power, and the modern capitalist class wields this power, it's only logical that these people would constitute the formal ruling class. This is not even a stretch within bourgeois social theory. Furthermore, we should question the historical understanding held by Hayek if this is his actual argumentation. How does he go about to explain the introduction of bourgeois society following the collapse of feudalism? How was that anything but a fundamental transfer of power from one class, the monarchy, aristocrats, to another, the bourgeoisie, as delineated in a series of correlated events and processes, French Revolution, market reforms, the Enlightenment, etc. In fact, providing a coherent understanding of history without some rudimentary knowledge of power and its squabbling seems almost impossible. The greatest moments in history are concerned with analyzing these dramatic transformations in power relations which have come to shape everything we understand about the world today. Depleting the historic arsenal of this analytic model is truly just debilitating the historical endeavor, not even that which is particularly Marxist. It shows quite plainly the lengths to which liberalism will reach simply to stifle dissent. Conceptually speaking, socialism would constitute a new power being developed from the internal contradictions of capitalism. However, this is not some uniquely original power which has been constructed from nothing. It contains within itself a long history of practice, theory, practice, or simply the method by which all theory is refined and made intelligible, history. This history can be found within the very spaces capitalism renders as necessary, the workplace, the family home, daily interactions, consumption, etc. Therefore, while this new power is new in the world historic sense of the term, it is not new to the aggregate experience of humanity. What is new, at least to most of the globe, is a fundamental rupture in the existence of capitalism wherein all power is transferred from the exploiters to the exploited, the most profound and arguably only precondition for the establishment of a genuine socialism. Hayek tries to support his claim with an abstract point on the relative weakness of a rich man to the lowest state functionary. The real-life implications of the comparison are laughable. Apparently the wealthiest and most elite commercial executives of North America are less significant than the lowest most menial county functionary because of undefined, certainly unrefined, reasons. Nothing more should even be said on the issue. However, the argumentative importance is apparent. Here, Hayek is dichotomizing two fields of almost equal inquiry. On one hand, the plain and apparent exploitation within the private market. On the other, the subtle and more structured legitimization and sustainment of that exploitation within the state apparatuses. A dichotomy which is subtle but no less important for the epistemic structuring of Hayek's arguments, wherein the state is always the quintessential boogeyman. He extends this argument into its logical conclusion: if it involves the state, it must instantly be bad. There will be no economic or social questions that would not be political questions, in the sense that their solution will depend exclusively on who wields the coercive power, on whose are the views that will prevail on all occasions. 21. The personal is political. Not only is the personal political, there is a certain level of personal politic which covers nearly every private engagement imaginable, making it possible to conceive of almost any relationship, event, or engagement as being thoroughly political, or arguably politicized. It is not as though once the economy comes under socialist planning suddenly most questions also become political questions. This is already the case now, and to an equal extent, wherein the limitations of bourgeois legality have yet to find a resting point. The real question is, what sort of political question is being asked, and to whom? Is it a question of liberation or exploitation? Of constructive growth or structured impediment? Is it wielded by the class of oppressors or the oppressed themselves? These are the fundamental questions we must ask when confronting this realm of the socio-economic political question. As mentioned earlier, this is precisely what Lenin was doing nearly 100 years ago when asked about the question of freedom within the Soviet Union. Freedom for who, over whom? Freedom to do what, to whom? We cannot escape the overwhelming importance of contextualizing power as a relationship and not an object of passive manipulation. Class power is exerted, forcefully, over the scope of society in such a way that all things are brought into its orbit, such as in bourgeois society today. Lenin understood that nothing can ever be left out of this context, including freedom. Instead, we should analyze what sorts of freedom an emancipated society can enjoy in contrast to that of the status quo. Understanding the issue systemically is the only path forward in analysis. Hayek answers this point by Lenin by recounting what he calls a necessity of politics over economics. What he means is that this sort of understanding put forward by Marxists, among other socialists, requires a dominating presence of politics in social life, interrupting the relative autonomy of economic subjects. Rather idealistic on his part, considering the already intimate relationship between the economic and political sphere, even with bourgeois society. It's no surprise that those most friendly to the monopolists and transnational capitalists reach the heights of bourgeois political structures. Although the relationship may not seem as pronounced as in socialism, where the relationship is really totalized into a cohesive structure, the economic is still uniquely political within capitalism. The difference is that, for the most part, the apparatuses of the state work back upon the competitive system to ensure its own longevity and correct internal contradictions. Take for example the number of bailouts witnessed over the past decade between international and national central banks, as well as rescue packages designed to correct inconsistencies and stagnation in growth of key industries. It's not as though the monopolists were sitting peacefully when the evil government rescue package came down into their coffers. They were actively involved in the drafting of such packages as a private-public joint endeavor to save economic vitality. The difference between these phenomena in capitalism and socialism is that in capitalism it is understood as a symptom of degeneration, an exception to the rule, rather than the rule itself, indulged only for the sake of survival. However, this could not be any more false. there is a long history of joint operation between the dichotomized spheres which took place long before any formal constitution of Keynesian economics, the other boogeyman of classical liberalism. Realizing this as it is, we see Lenin's claims, and our own, to be instructive and descriptive rather than some political cynicism. Understanding the nuance of class rule, and how in fact we go about securing this rule for the purpose of liberation, is absolutely invaluable to our struggle. Therefore, we can speak plainly on matters perhaps considered controversial by Hayek or contemporary liberal political philosophers. Socialism is the institutionalized power of the exploited and oppressed, wielded against their exploiters and oppressors, for the purpose of worldwide emancipation. Hayek then addresses the issue of socialist remuneration as it was termed. Essentially, how would someone be remunerated for their labor within socialism? Hayek of course chooses the route of least resistance and addresses the old slogan by unionists of every worker receiving the full value of her labor. This is an outdated and obsolete slogan for a few reasons. First, because the full value of any specific labor is very difficult to neatly quantize and then prepare for remuneration with respect to the whole process of labor. Second, labor, as referenced previously, occurs always in a network of production, if it is socially necessary, and very rarely so in the performatively individual sense. How can we measure one person's labor against another within the same process? It would be very difficult, at the very least. Third, and as Marx points out, there must always be some reserve from the full value taken for purposes of broader advancement and security, emergency resources, infrastructure, security, etc. He does not know taxes, and this is very critical to the Marxist understanding as it still provides an exclusive measure by which we can be gone with the bourgeois instruments of growth. Regardless, any productive society must keep some sort of surplus if it hopes to keep secure in its own advance. Therefore this old slogan has been retired from any substantive usage. What has replaced it is a call for a more deserving form of equality than some quasi-bourgeois workerist entitlement. Every person should receive according to their need, desire, and perform according to their ability, capacity, with respect to inconsistencies in the early stages of socialism. Beyond the obvious differences, there is a very important theoretical rupture between the old slogan and what we utilize now. Before, the primary relation in the realm of the abstract worker was the full value of her labor. Now this labor is balanced by her capacity and primary respect is shown to her desires. It is not liberating to simply envelope everyone into the petty bourgeois personhood of full and independent value. We must instead crush these institutions as promoting an alienating form of being that all individuals are forced into. Our newer slogan is more ambiguous in its concrete application, but this ambiguity is empowering to the masses before it is limiting. It leaves the door open to this freely associated development which the masses must carve from the web of speculation into a real historical legacy. Beyond that, the primary mediation within socialism is indeed social and not capital or abstract labor. Such social mediation must be fully overcome if socialism is to have any meaningful existence. It is because successful planning requires the creation of a common view on the essential values that the restriction of our freedom with regard to material things touches so directly on our spiritual freedom. 22. Quite a loaded statement, but one fitting for the end of the chapter. Once again he returns to discussing this creation of a universal set of essential values that will necessarily restrict individual freedom to the point which even spiritual freedom is offended. His view is consistently idealistic and cannot touch the descriptive power of historical materialism. What he is referring to with his set of essential values is really those subordinate values which exist in our current society. The secondary aspect of the contradiction already within full play. The historically developed and refined values of the oppressed which find animation in the most peculiar of social spaces. These are the values which will be constituted as ruling during the establishment of socialism. To put it quite simply, the class rule of the oppressed will be characterized in an instrumentally similar, yet qualitatively different, fashion to that of the status quo, wherein the values of some are suppressed so that the values of others can prevail. However, This takes a very different form within socialism. In socialism, the values being suppressed are those of the world historic enemies of the people, the values of misogynists, racists, transphobes, heterosexists, and all manner of oppressive personas. Those which prevail would be those of liberation, of solidarity and mutual respect, of inclusive and egalitarian methods of production/reproduction and organization. Who could oppose such a future? Essential values are not necessary for the functioning of socialism. What is necessary is the class rule of the oppressed. What they take with them is the accumulation of socio-political and moral experiences which define their action and worldview as it fits. This is the closest thing to any essential values that Hayek refers to, but at the same time very unfamiliar. For the dominating presence is no longer the all-present specter of capital, but the intimate and unique interrelations between humans themselves. This directness and historic opportunity of free development offers pathways to roots of liberty never experienced before, and perhaps that which will define whole new modes of thought and existence. So much that any speculative condemnation of essential values should be disregarded as the apologism it is. When we deal with this issue of socialism, we are not setting out on an object of study similar to other sciences. There is no anthropological endeavor which can unravel the mysteries of socialism. There is no political economist who can interpret a few sources, splice a few statistics, and arrive at some holistic model of such. We are dealing with something that is explicitly historical, carrying along with it a long legacy of theory, practice, and even failure. Contained within the halls of socialism are of course those remnants of bourgeois society which in themselves reflect the historical accumulation of progress by humanity, that ubiquitous sum of all struggles which pervades all received meaning in our lives, but never without a mask of immanence. But as for the concrete and uniquely human experience of socialism, we still remain quite novices. And this is not something to be frowned upon. What it means is that we have a long road to pave before us and to construct this universe which remains the only frontier still worth exploring. What we do know is certainly structural. To recall Lenin, whose knowledge began this chapter and whose knowledge still informs us today, the question is not of what but by who and towards whom. We answer unapologetically and to the great despair of reactionaries in every corner of the world, socialism is power by the masses, for the masses, over the material and social circumstances which dominate their lives. Anything more is at best speculative, anything less is nothing at all.